Good evening. Welcome to show number 47 under Harmony with Nature. I'm your host, Shalom Mandeville. This is being pre-taped on the 6th of June, 1989. I'm very proud to present to you my guest for tonight, who is Dave Morantz. He's a habitat biologist with the Evaluation and Mitigation Division of the Habitat Management Branch of the Federal Fisheries. And by qualifications, he has got a master's degree in biology from Dalhousie, and by coincidence, he's a student of Dr. Ogden, who has been on this show several times and who's an advisor to the Sackville Rivers Advisory Board. Mr. Morantz, before I give the floor to you, and since this is going to be a very detailed show on different slides, as you know, all of us are worried about siltation and the effect of it on aquatic habitat. Now, what is the figure in literature about the acceptable level of siltation from an aquatic point of view?
Well, first of all, I'd like to start off by by saying that, in fact, there are no safe levels of siltation. Mm-hmm. Silt is one of those pollutants that is cumulative in the environment, and so you can specify some limit, but over time those limits build up, or the amounts build up in the environment. However, the concentrations that are permitted in the metal mining regulations of Environment Canada are 50 milligrams per liter in a grab sample, in just one sample that is collected at any time, and 25 milligrams per liter composite sample over a month period.
Okay. Now, since this is going to be a very interesting show with slides and other things about different types of fish, the rest of the show will be a lecture given by Dave Morantz.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, by the way. Well, to start off, I'd like to say that siltation is perhaps the most insidious of our pollutants. We all think about various number of chemicals, various number of pollutants such as acid rain, toxic chemicals, heavy metals, PCBs, and people generally think of all of these as being the cause of the decline in our fisheries, salmon and trout, in the province. But in fact, it's probably siltation that is the major cause of habitat damage and of destruction of a lot of our fisheries potential, both in this province and throughout the Maritimes. As an example, there are many streams. This one, for example, that you can see, has been completely destroyed by siltation. Well, what is silt? Silt is very fine particulate material that's caused by erosion of soil that ends up, sooner or later, flowing into streams. It's available either in the suspended form or, and of course, clouding the water, such as you see here, or in the settled form, where it settles to the stream bottom. And perhaps this, as we'll see in a little while, is the most important and the most destructive of the two. Of course, the settled and the suspended forms can be interchanged. Simply by high water flows, the settled component of silt can be reactivated into the water column and flushed downstream, or simply by somebody walking through the stream itself. The cause or the end result is, of course, something like this: sandbars or silt bars, and only water on the periphery of the stream. Really very, very little room for salmon or trout or any other species to survive. What are the effects? Well, there are several. We'll start with those direct effects on fish, the direct effects that people think of most often when they think about the problems of siltation. You can think of silt flowing in suspended form as flowing sandpaper. In fact, those tiny particles flowing by a fish cause the body surface of the fish to be abraded or roughened so that it is exposed to all sorts of diseases. And of course, the gill tissues, those most sensitive tissues, can be completely clogged to the point where the fish, as this one, has suffocated. The problem is definitely more severe when we think of small fish. These are the fish that cannot tolerate very much silt at all. Larger fish, such as our large salmon, which we all know of, swim through the Bay of Fundy, which is quite naturally silty. They are capable of tolerating higher levels of silt, but not always. Here's a trout, a pan-sized trout that we'd all be fairly happy to catch. And this one, although it doesn't look much like a fish anymore, has been completely suffocated, completely surrounded by silt. This is not an isolated case. These happen frequently. Well, those things happen, but it takes a very, very large amount of silt, very high concentrations, to kill fish such as that one. But there are effects which are much more dramatic, but much less visible. And these are the effects on eggs and alevins. And I should explain that alevins are also known as sac fry. This is the life stage of salmon and trout that occurs after the egg hatches. And we'll see a picture of that in just a minute. The salmon adult female is very, very specific about where it deposits its eggs. Almost always, it's at the bottom end of a pool, just where the water starts to become more shallow and where water flows increase in velocity. And that spot is chosen for a very, very good reason. With those combination of factors, water is forced down through the gravel, as you can see by the arrows. That water, of course, carries life-breathing oxygen to the eggs, which are deposited in just that location underneath the gravel. And those eggs are deposited there in the fall and lie buried under the gravel for a period of several months over winter and into spring. That water, carrying the oxygen flowing through the gravel, takes oxygen to the eggs and removes metabolic wastes. If you prevent that water flow, the eggs will suffocate and die. These eggs are extremely sensitive, and perhaps the most sensitive life stage, to silt. And what happens, of course, if there's an activity which causes erosion and siltation after the eggs have been deposited in the gravel, there is no recourse for these eggs but to suffocate. They cannot swim, they cannot move away from the area, and so they almost inevitably will die. And of course, if you remove the production of the eggs, if you destroy the eggs, there can no longer be any potential for production of fish in that stream. And this is the alevin I was mentioning. At the beginning of spring, the eggs hatch at the particular time when water temperatures start to rise and when daylight becomes greater and longer. And these sac fry are buried in the same location as the eggs, and they stay within the gravel for the next 3 weeks to a month, depending on water temperatures. And you see that sac, well, they're very dependent on that for the next month because they survive solely on that yolk sac. They do not feed actively. They do not really swim very actively. So the same problems occur to these alevins or sac fry as they do to eggs. If the spaces between the gravel, stones, become filled with silt so that water cannot flow through the gravel, these sac fry will also suffocate because they are not getting oxygen. At the end of that 3 weeks to a month period, those alevins actively start to wriggle up through the gravel and emerge above the gravel into the flowing water. At this time, as you can see here, the yolk sac has been completely absorbed, and now they are required to start actively finding food in order to survive. Now, what happens, of course, if you end up with silt covering the bottom? Well, these things cannot wriggle up through the substrate. They cannot find their way to the surface, so they will either suffocate again because they are not getting oxygen, or they will starve to death because they are not capable of finding food underneath the gravel surface. They have to emerge in order to swim and catch food. This is the sort of situation which I've described, which will prevent production of fish, which will cause suffocation of the eggs, suffocation of the sac fry, and prevent the sac fry from wriggling up through the gravel and emerging into the stream. Well, let's go beyond that if that's not bad enough, of course. We now have the several effects that you see here on the food chain. We'll describe them with slides. A stream requires light to produce plant growth. Algae, plants that are clinging to the stream bottom. And the reason that that becomes important is because it drives the whole food chain or food web. Those plants are fed on by invertebrates, by small animals, which are in turn fed upon by fish. And if you break that chain at any point, of course, then you eliminate again the possibility of production, or at least you reduce the amount of fish that are produced. So that light penetration, which drives the whole process of plant growth, is very critical. You can see here exactly what I'm talking about, that plant growth on the stream bottom in the same sort of area where this salmon parr finds its home. Well, what happens where a stream is badly silted so that light cannot penetrate? We, of course, reduce the amount of production of plants, and by doing so we reduce the rest of the food chain. In the same way, these invertebrates, such as this little guy, which is a black fly larva, which is aquatic, it depends on flowing water. This is fish food. This is dependent on that production of plant growth. So these invertebrates will not survive, of course, if in fact there is no plant growth in the stream. But it goes beyond that. If we remember back to that flowing sandpaper, these little creatures are subject to the same problems as our fish. That flowing sandpaper will abrade the body surfaces of those tiny, tiny larvae, or they will damage the gill surfaces so that these invertebrates cannot survive. And by doing that, then fish have either a reduced supply of food or none at all in the stream. And this is really an example of what I was referring to. We have a barren stream, a stream that has been badly silted, badly damaged. It no longer produces any form of life. It goes beyond that, of course. We now have the effects on salmon habitat and trout habitat and all of those other species that are dependent upon streams for survival. Well, just what are those effects? If we think about salmon or trout, we have to remember that these species, particularly the juvenile stages, as we see here in this salmon parr, are intimately linked to the bottom of the stream, to the substrate. That is their world. They are always near the bottom for protection, protection from predators, protection from excessive water velocities, because although they're extremely good swimmers, they still can be flushed downstream under flood conditions. And where that happens, they may be subject to predation or excessive competition from other fish. So they're very selective about where they want to be. And if you happen to be snorkeling under the surface of the water in a salmon stream, you can see all of these parr finding their territory and clinging onto that territory as if it's the best possible spot in the world to be. And if you disturb them, if you cast a shadow over them so that it looks like perhaps it might be a bird of prey, the first thing that these fish will do is scurry into the substrate, in between those rock spaces where they find protection. But it goes beyond that, of course, because that's exactly where their food supply is clinging to as well. Right down on those stones is where those invertebrates are found. Salmon and trout will lie near the stream bottom. They'll dart up into the water column to grab some food, and right back they go. The reason I go through this is because if we think now about clogging that bottom, filling those spaces in the gravel with silt, we realize that there's really nowhere for those fish to hide in case of problems, in case of predators or excessive water velocities. And they will either get flushed downstream, or they will be eaten by other species of fish or by birds. And again, this is the situation which prevents fish from finding space, habitat on a stream bottom. This is a barren stream bottom for fish. Well, there's more than that. Fish such as salmon and trout don't have any magic senses that allows them to catch food or find food. They depend on eyesight. As you can see to the right of this fish, the salmon, those are again blackfly larvae clinging on to that piece of vegetation. And it depends on eyesight to find them and catch them. Well, that sort of visibility is very clear, you might say, in a stream like this. But what happens when a stream looks more like this one, where you really can't see 2 inches in front of you? That fish cannot find its food supply. It will die, or it will be at least forced to move out of that area very quickly in order to find food. We've all seen many, many situations of streams that are so clouded, like this one, so turbid, that you couldn't even see the back end of a frog if you happen to be looking at its head. There's one very important factor that we must remember when it comes to silt. Once the silt finds its way into the stream, it takes a great deal of time for that silt generally, once it finds its way into the substrate, to move downstream. However, the effects are not isolated to a specific location. As we can see here, in the middle of the picture, there's a very small stream feeding that whitish silt into this much larger river. That silt flows and flows until it finally reaches an area where water velocities are no longer capable of keeping it in suspension, and then it settles to the bottom. So we can talk about a tiny point source of silt, as we see here, affecting many kilometers of stream. And the fact is that once that silt gets into the stream bottom, it can stay there for anywhere from minutes to decades, depending on conditions at that particular location, water velocities, the nature of the stream bottom. That is why I said at the outset we have a cumulative problem. If the siltation is permitted to continue for prolonged periods of time, we end up with severe accumulations and severely long periods of time until the stream can clean itself. Well, I've talked about the effects of siltation. What are the causes? And the causes are many. Sure, silt is produced naturally. We all know of banks of streams that are collapsed because of natural weathering. This happens in isolated situations. This happens periodically. But it is not a volume of silt the stream can't handle. What has happened over the years, and particularly since the use of heavy equipment over the past 50 years, is that we have added to that silt burden astronomically. Machines such as this forwarder used in logging, crossing streams, churning up the stream bottom. Skidder trails, again used in forestry, which indiscriminately gouge areas near the stream and create flowing rivers of silt after a rainstorm or after a snowmelt. And of course, where does all of this flowing silt end up? It has to end up at the lowest point of the geological features, which happens to be a stream or a lake. We have heavy equipment working on road construction, bridge construction, such as this one. And while these things are slowly but surely being stopped, we all know that periodically they go on, causing the silt problems that you see in this shot. There are simple things, at least simple from the point of view of numbers. There are many, many cases of these, and so we think of them as being routine. We cross them, we pass them all the time, and don't give any thought to them. But something as simple, again, as ditches. Ditches are part of road construction. But if their ditches are installed improperly, for years they can be sources of silt, which end up in a stream at the bottom of the ditch. And channelization. Channelization used for a variety of things. For flood control. If somebody doesn't happen to want the stream flowing through their backyard, it's channelized, it's rerouted. And as you can see here, that not only immediately eliminates the habitat of fish, but it causes silt problems that are ongoing and continuing for many, many years. The slopes of large roads, and even small roads, of course, if they're not stabilized, are sources of erosion and sedimentation, siltation, which again find their way into streams. This is an agricultural site. In agricultural areas, and at least in many, particularly in Nova Scotia, drainage is important, and farmers wish to improve the drainage on their land. Well, what better way of doing that than to dredge down a stream to lower the water table? Well, in some cases that can be done without harm to a stream, if that stream, of course, does not possess fish of its own. But in many other situations, it's been done indiscriminately, without thought of what might happen either to the fisheries of the stream itself or to downstream areas. And as you see here, the slopes of this ditch now are sources of silt after a rainstorm when water levels are much higher. And it's interesting to note here this drainage ditch or channel that has been cut away in order to improve drainage. And you see where the fence posts are here, and you see that there are the areas of erosion and grass slumping. Well, if we look just a few months later, we now see what has happened to exactly those same fence posts. It doesn't take much time before flowing water can cut away a bank very quickly. And all of that earth, of course, and silt ends up downstream on some trout or salmon spawning grounds. Urban development is a source rich in silt. This happens to be an industrial park that was being constructed, an industrial park that happened to have a nice trout stream running right through it. But it was felt that that was not suitable for an industrial park. It perhaps occupied too much land mass, and so it was decided to reroute that stream. It was rerouted to the periphery of the property. I guess after going through everything I've said so far, I don't have to say again that this stream is no longer a fishery stream and may not be for many, many years. And urban development that we're perhaps more familiar with, housing development, and this one's a little bit closer to home here in Sackville. A housing development where there was no thought, or very little anyway, to protection of the soil, to stabilization of soil. There was one small settling pond constructed, which was not adequate to contain all of the silt and all of the drainage from the site. And so most of that flowed off, and you can see just a bit to the right, a channel flowing ultimately to the Little Sackville River. But I suppose most important to note here is the wide spaces of exposed soil. And it is just this sort of situation which promotes rapid erosion, rapid siltation downstream. These are just a very few brief examples of the kinds of things that go on all the time that we see within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that the province sees through their Provincial Department of the Environment. These are the things that we see that cause problems. But there are solutions. I certainly don't want to leave you thinking that things are an out-and-out mess out there. There are solutions, and they're all very simple, and most of them completely inexpensive and very easy to install. Very simple little berms that can be installed in ditches to break the flow of water, to allow silt to drop out of suspension before it reaches a stream. Cut-off ditches on larger roads. Cut-off ditches which channel the water and its silt into a wooded area where it can be filtered by the debris on the forest floor. And then if there must be a temporary rerouting of a stream, for instance for the installation of a culvert, simple plastic that can be obtained at any hardware store to prevent the stream or the temporary channel from being eroded. Cofferdams to isolate a construction area from a stream, and you can see here very clearly how effective that can be to restrict the flow of silt to the flowing water. The same thing here. This cofferdam built out of nothing more than sandbags. Of course, cofferdams can be installed correctly and used improperly, as we see here. They had the right idea, they didn't quite follow through. An envirofence, just a filter fabric material which is placed on land to prevent sheet erosion or erosion over a wide area and subsequent siltation. from reaching a stream, as we see here in the middle of the picture at the bottom of the slope. Or a settling pond. If it's properly sized, properly constructed, settling ponds can be very effective during construction to, again, hold up water so that the silt burden falls out of suspension and then can be cleaned from the bottom of the settling pond later on and deposited in a safe place. On the slopes of roads or on the slopes of any sort of embankment leading down to a stream, there are a number of alternatives. This one is a fabric mat that can be laid down. It's really nothing more than straw in a fabric with seed, grass seed, impregnated inside. And in a very short time, through this burlappy type material, we have grass growing, rooted down, and stabilizing the bank. Hand seeding, using just a mechanical spreader with a variety of different types of seeds which will hold under different soil conditions, different climatic conditions. In many cases, they can root very fast and stabilize the soil. And of course, there's hydroseeding, which is sprayed onto banks. Hydroseeding contains a mulch and nutrients to promote the very, very rapid growth of plants, particularly grasses. And these are very effective on steep slopes to get plants growing quickly for stabilization purposes. We've gone through the three factors. We've gone through the problems associated with silt, the causes, and we've gone through some of the mitigation methods that can be employed, those things that can be done to improve the situation or prevent siltation before it starts. But I think I'd like to end this slideshow by saying that all of these things are unimportant if our attitude towards the environment, towards protection of aquatic resources, towards protection of fisheries resources, if that attitude does not change dramatically. It's only that change of attitude which is going to permit us to implement planning, to implement environmental controls in the planning process. And if we do that, then costs are reduced, the environment is protected, and of course we end up with fisheries resources such as this little salmon, this larger trout, and of course this wonderful salmon for our future generations. And I think that that is what is critical for all of us. Thank you.
Well, it was a very interesting show, Mr. Morantz, and we have been promoting, all kinds of planning and wetland preservation and all that in a very, very big way. And I guess we have run out of time, and I congratulate you for such a big, very important speech. And if we even, made even 1% effect on our listeners, I think we have succeeded.
Thank you very much.